Hi everyone, in this video I'm going to talk a little bit about the presidency of Ronald Reagan as in some ways the high point of the conservative revival that we're examining in this week. Reagan had come to prominence initially as someone who supported FDR's New Deal, but then someone who was opposed to Lyndon B. Johnson's Great Society, seeing that movement as the government becoming too involved in ordinary Americans' lives. And so Reagan comes to power as president. He drifts further and further to the right. He becomes a Republican. He's elected as the Republican governor of California as part of this conservative revival that is anti-communist, anti-government interference, and against progressive values. So he becomes governor of California, and then he becomes president. And he rides this conservative movement known as the Liberty Coalition into office. He's someone who's not seen as necessarily an original thinker, but someone who was seen as deeply committed to promoting the United States and someone who was immensely charismatic. And so once again, we're going to see the same pattern with Reagan that we've seen with Carter and Nixon. He has very limited success domestically, but in foreign policy, he sees a number of significant and important successes. Domestically, he begins by cutting taxes and cutting Social Security and also Medicare in an effort to try and kickstart the United States economy. And so he reduces and simplifies the tax code until it's down to just two bands. You're either in the 15% tax bracket or you're in the 28% tax bracket. So the tax code has been dramatically simplified, and it's also been the tax levels, the rates of tax have been significantly lowered. Nevertheless, this does not immediately produce the kind of economic turnaround that people were hoping for. Americans have more money, but there are struggles for Americans at the bottom of society. The poorest Americans continue to struggle in the 1980s. This is a result of the changing global economy. That the United States is very much tied into a global economy at this point, and that production is becoming significantly cheaper in the emerging economies around the world, especially the Asian economies and especially China. And American industrial production begins to struggle to keep up with these rival economies. And so you start to see jobs for the poorer bracket of American society shifting away from production jobs and shifting more towards service jobs. And service jobs generally provide a lower income than industrial and production jobs. And so you start to see that the poorer bracket of American society is becoming poorer. There are other challenges that Americans are facing as well. Even though there is more money available because of cuts in taxation, inflation hasn't slowed down, and Americans continue to spend at greater and greater rates. And so by the time we get to Reagan's presidency, around 110 million Americans average 7 credit cards each. So each American is piling up mass amounts of debt at the same time as the federal government is piling up piles and piles of debt. Even though taxes have been decreased, the increase in revenue doesn't make up for the increase in spending on entitlement programs like Social Security and Medicare as the population in retirement gets bigger and bigger. And so this means this leads to a stock market crash in 1987, where these high levels of debt eventually spook investors and the market sees a dramatic fall off. And so this is, well into Reagan's second term. There's still a lot of economic uncertainty at home in the United States. And so these are the challenges that Reagan faces in his policies at home. Abroad, in terms of foreign policy, especially in terms of the Cold War, he is much more successful. He comes into office committed to opposing communism, committed to winning the Cold War. And he follows The strategy that Nixon had started to employ, and going way back to the 1940s, that George Kennan, the strategist for Truman, had advocated. And that's using the economic power of Western capitalist economies. We see this first of all in his, and most significantly, in his Star Wars campaign. And this is the campaign to establish satellites that could shoot down Soviet missiles. And this was really important because up until this point, you'd had this strategy of MAD, mutually assured destruction, which asserted that both sides, the Russians and the Americans, had submarines armed with nuclear missiles all around the world. And so if one country, let's say the United States, attacked the Soviet Union could respond with lethal destructive force. And so there was no way for one side to start a nuclear war, totally defeat the other, without also receiving all the ill effects of a nuclear holocaust. What the Star Wars program suggests is possible is that the United States could launch an attack, a nuclear attack on the Russians, and then shoot down the missiles that the Russians would fire in response. In the end, it's never actually proven that this is possible, but the Soviets have to invest in new technologies, they have to explore these Star Wars technologies as well, and their economy is struggling to cope with the huge expenditures required for this type of program. Of course, these huge expenditures increase the federal debt when the United States is going through all these economic difficulties. So this is the balance that Reagan is dealing with, trying to win the Cold War, trying to defeat communism and the Soviet Union, at the same time as at home, some Americans are struggling with growing amounts of poverty. Some Americans are increasingly wealthy, but there is a growing divide between the Americans who are becoming more wealthy and the Americans who are becoming poorer. We also see Reagan continuing to employ an Eisenhower-type strategy in other parts of the world, that he provides funding to resist communist governments and communist revolutions across Latin America, in El Salvador, in Nicaragua, in Guatemala. These become the Nicaragua case becomes something of a scandal when it's discovered that the government is paying for this out of money from doing deals with the Iranians, who, after the Iranian Revolution of 1979, had expressed deep opposition to the United States. Nevertheless, Reagan is successful in preventing the further expansion of communism at the same time as he is putting the Soviet Union under increasingly intolerable economic pressure. And this, in the end, will lead to the end of the Cold War.